there's an introductory verse which we introduced the Amidah, which said that the concept of what we call the Shemon Esrei, the prayer, the tefillah, which is a question whether it's a doraisa, whether it's a Torah obligation, the format of the tefillah, what we call the Shemon Esrei, it's referred to as Shemon Esrei because there are 18 blessings. However, factually speaking, there are 19 blessings. There aren't 18 blessings. But initially there were 18 blessings, and later they added another blessing. Because something we will discuss, but initially with 18, and we discussed why they chose 18. And the men of the High Assembly, they chose 18 to supplicate Hashem with 18, not with 18 blessings, because the introductory blessings, which are known as avos, of the blessings of the patriarchs, which includes resurrection. It speaks about God in terms of his dimension of nothing comparable to what he is. Then there's the supplication, and there's the closing blessings of thanks. We acknowledge Hashem for everything that we have. That's the modim. The format of first to identify who God is within the context that we're able to, that introduction is a Torah law. When you supplicate Hashem, you have to first have the introductory blessings. Then you have the supplication, and then you give thanks for all that he has done for you. What he has done, what he does do at presently. This is the format. So the format is a Torah format. The actual words and what we ask for and how we supplicate, that was authored by the men of the High Assembly. And they chose that the introduction to the Amidah, before we say, Baruch Atah Hashem, blessed are you, God, we cite a verse from Tehillim, the words of David, Hashem sosai tiftach v'yagid hilosecho. Hashem, open my lips, allow my mouth to speak your praises. Those are the words of David. It's not the tefillah itself. That is not part of the Shemon Esrei. It's the introduction to the Shemon Esrei. Meaning after we take 3 steps forward and we stand in the audience with God, as the Gemara discerns between Kriyat Shema, when a Jew declares his belief in God, and the Amidah, one is a declaration of belief, the other one is an audience with God. You're standing before God and having an audience, and he allows you to have the audience, and therefore the mindset and the demeanor and the humility, when one says the Amidah, it's a different level. Because when you stand before the Creator, the one who sustains and wills every moment of every aspect of existence, you have to be humbled. Because if you're not humbled and you don't have that sense of humility in his presence, therefore you don't even relate and have sufficient respect for who you stand. So therefore, firstly, being needy, understanding that that you're a person in need, and without him, your existence has no value. Therefore, that mindset is very essential to the value of what you're going to say. It's not a prerequisite which will invalidate the Amidah, but in terms of giving special value to the Amidah, the greater degree that we have that sense of before who was speaking, greater value those words have. Because as I said, if you're standing before God and you have no sense of what that means, or it's irrelevant and you're just going through lip service, or doing it as purely an obligation, but you have no sense of what he is, and it's irrelevant what he is, although you fulfill your obligation of prayer, but in terms of his response, it's very questionable to what degree he will respond, because it's lacking in the core of what that is, which is the reverence and the sense of negation in his presence. So before we begin the Amidah, the men of the High Assembly in Anshe Knesset Gedolah, they legislated. It must be introduced with David's words from Psalms. Hashem svosei tiftach ufi agiti losecho. Hashem svosei tiftach. God, open my lips and allow my mouth to speak your praises. We spoke about the various appellations of God. The appellation for Hashem svosei tiftach is Adni. It's spelled Aleph Daled Nun Yud. It's not spelled Yud Kei Vav Kei. Yud Kei Vav Kei, as we said, is pronounced Adni. But its connotation is, besides being master, he is infinite. He was, is, and in the future. Here it's Adni, master. When David stood before God and he says, Adni, master of all, open my lips and allow my lips, let my mouth to speak your praises. That means it's the totality of a subject before a master. David is referring to Hashem as the master Adni. My master, because you're my master and I am your subject, and I want to serve you and be fully dedicated to you, I need your assistance to express what I'm supposed to express. If it's an obligation, what I'm obligated to express. If it's not an obligation, as Ramban, Nachmanides, rabbinically, or if I should choose to pray, assist me in being able to articulate the words as they have to be articulated. That they should be words of praise. What happens if a person, some reason, in haste, he begins the Amidah, and if he forgets to say, Hashem svosei tiftach ufi agiti losecho, he doesn't say the introductory verse to the Amidah. Does one fulfill his obligation of tefillah, of prayer? Halachically speaking, he does fulfill it. Because it's only an introduction to the Amidah, it's not the actual Amidah. The Amidah itself begins with Baruch Atah Hashem. Blessed are you, God. That's Baruch Atah Hashem, which we'll discuss separately. So the obvious question is, from the moment we open our eyes, a person, if he has no speech impediment, if he has the power of speech, he speaks naturally. But yet when we stand before God, we say to Hashem, Master, open my lips and allow my mouth to speak your praises. What do we have to make this special request before we begin the audience, or the beginning of the audience? And this is our request. Hashem svosei tiftach ufi agiti losecho. Now it's interesting. The first three blessings of the Amidah are not requests. They're not supplications. It's acknowledgements. We acknowledge who is God. He is the God of Avram, the God of Abraham, Yitzchak and Yaakov. Great, powerful, awesome. Remembers the kindness of the forefathers. The second blessing sustains life, resurrects the dead, so on and so forth. You are holy, your name's holy, those who praise you are holy. So we're speaking about God himself. Hashem svosei tiftach, the introductory verse is a supplication. We're asking God to assist us. Like we ask God to give us discretion, insight, and understanding, we're asking Hashem, open my lips and allow me to say your praises. So it's the introductory verse is a supplication. So the Amidah, so the audience should be an appropriate audience. It should not in any way lack in what it should be. The way a subject stands before a master or before a king and speaks to the king. no less than the most advanced level of reverence and respect and subordination, feeling inadequate in his presence, understanding that he being the king, you being the subject, you have no value unto yourself. Your value is only to serve the king. I would say a person is either conscripted into the armed forces of the United States or he joins. The moment you sign up to be part of the United States Armed Forces, you become a GI. You are a government issue. You've given up for the term, for the amount of time you're going to be in the Army or the Navy, whatever the part of the armed forces you may be in, you are owned by them. You are a government issue. And the way you put a dog tag on a dog, they put a dog tag on the soldier. Give him a number, and that's who he is. That's his identification. The number. The name is secondary because you are the subject of the army. Lahavdil. We are God's subjects. Meaning our value is not unto ourselves. Our value is purely to serve him. That's the subject. So how do we declare that? How do we even acknowledge that? By saying, Adni, the introductory verse, Hashem Sosei Tiftoch V'Yagit Yilecho. I'm so at a level of inadequacy, I need your assistance to open my lips, to say your praises. But all day, at every moment of existence, we don't need God to assist us to open our lips. So why at this moment, yes? So Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, which I've mentioned in the past, in the introductory, one of the classes of Tefillah, he explains that he told over a story about the Tsar Nikolai II, who was a rabid anti-Semite, who introduced the 25-year draft to Christianize the Jews. And they would take the children who were 9, 10 years old, literally steal them from their parents, force them out of the jurisdiction of the parents and send them off to some kind of school and Christianize them. And after returning 25 years later, they didn't have much of a trace of what they originally were. And he issued a decree and they had to go and somehow petition him with various ways, whether it's bribery or to plead for mercy. But so they located a Jew who was able to speak classical Russian, because the average Jew could not speak classical Russian. And they found that Jew, but it was enough that he could speak the Russian. He had to have all the mannerisms of a person coming before the Tsar, because the Tsar, being such a rabid anti-Semite, if he would even sense a lack of reverence and respect, he'd go into a tirade and could be disastrous. So he practiced for months how he would articulate it, what would be the tenor of his voice, what would be his body language, which would indicate total submission and total reverence. Because they kept saying to him, because you realize if it doesn't come across right, it'll be disastrous. And this person conjured in his mind all these terrible possibilities that when he finally came to speak to the Tsar, he lost his power of speech due to the overwhelming level of fear, understanding what the Tsar could do if he should actually sense that it's not on par where he thinks it should be. Lahavdil elef havdolos. To differentiate between holy and profane. Profane on the most exaggerated level when I speak about the czar. If a person would have any sense of before who he stands, it would be impossible to utter a word. You would be negated understanding who God is. He is not only your creator, every moment, every aspect of your being, every sense that you have, every fiber of your being is because at this moment he's willing it. And you're standing before him, we are totally, regardless how perfect you are, you're unworthy to stand in his presence. And he's allowing you to stand in his presence. A person can internalize that reality, you cannot utter a word. Due to the overwhelming level of fear and trepidation, your mind would stop functioning. You couldn't have the mental capacity or the focus to even articulate a word, which words naturally come to us. There's an expression, he lost his tongue. What happened? That's to that degree. But factually speaking, who are we kidding? If we would be at that level, we understand you need assistance, that despite that sense of negation, an overwhelming level of humility, you need special divine intervention to give you ability to speak, but we're not there. Because even if you would omit that introductory phrase, we have no difficulty speaking. But nevertheless, we say that introductory phrase. The words of David HaMelech, the words from Psalms, because what are we saying? In truth, we're not there. But factually, we acknowledge through that introductory statement who you are. In fact, I should be negated. I should not be able to utter a word if I'd have the capacity to appreciate before who I stand. I acknowledge that reality. And because I acknowledge that reality, give me the assistance to be able to utter the words, although it's not relevant to me. But conceptually speaking, I acknowledge that's what it should be. So therefore, unfortunately, I'm not there, but I acknowledge that's the way it should be. And therefore, we ask God to open our lips and give us the ability to say his praises. That's Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. The way we explained it in the past was this way, that it's a reality in our lives, the very few things we have no control over. Even if you don't want to do something, we could force ourselves to do things. Even if we want to do something, we could suppress that want or that need and not do it and not cross that line. Person doesn't want to give charity, you can force yourself to give tzedakah. You don't want to observe the Shabbos, you could refrain and withhold yourself from transgressing. Whatever it may be, any mitzvah. However, when it comes to tefillah, when it comes to our minds, we have no control over our minds. Because a person's mind is touched by his surroundings, by his experiences, past, present, and future desires or concerns or worries, the mind is continuously occupied. So if your mind is continuously occupied and it's not vacant and it's not available at this moment, and now I have an audience with a king. Person, as they say, person has a lot on his mind. We all have a lot on our minds. whether it's minutia, whether it's important issues of importance, doesn't make a difference. But when we stand before God, and God is aware not only of the words that come out of our mouths, that we articulate them, and as perfectly as you may articulate it, with all the intonations of reverence, of love, whatever it may be, but God knows what's going on in our minds, how our emotions, our feelings are intermingled and touching those words. So let's say a person stands before God and the words sound one of a kind of expression of humility and servitude and subservience and negation. But in his heart, he has other things going on. In his mind, he has other things. And he's thinking about other things. And God's aware of that. Are those words of praise? Or those words are duplicitous? It's like being two-faced. You're saying one thing and your mind is elsewhere. It's inappropriate. It's disgraceful. God should react to this. But yet, he listens. And he gives it value. Why? Because before we start the Abida, we say to Hashem, we're not where we should be. That's not a question. Our minds are not fully under our control. Why? Because our minds are not continuously invested in your service. We are not where we should be. When it says, even when we say, I say, Toroscho keva, mlachatcha roi, your Torah should be primary and your work should be secondary. Even if when it's secondary, we still have a self-interest in that material. The moment is, it's not that every interest in the material is purely to facilitate the spiritual. If it's purely to facilitate the spiritual, and every aspect of physicality is only for the sake of serving God, so the person's mind is singly focused. Only do the will of God, nothing other than that. But who's at that level? Very few people on that level. So if we're not at that level, so as we articulate and say those words, as much as we want to stand in reverence, in subservience, things filter into our minds. Those thoughts come to us. Other concerns come to us. Self-concerns, unrelated to God. It's disgraceful, it's inappropriate. So we say, as an introductory statement to the Amidah, when we're standing to begin articulating the words of the Amidah, we say, Hashem sfosai tiftoch. God, open my lips, and what should those lips speak? Ufi yagiti losecho. Let my mouth speak your praises. It's praises means not only the words are praises, the words are simple. You read the words out of the Siddur. That text was authored. That's what we call boilerplate, lahavdil. That's boilerplate, that text. It has to be infused with an intent, with a subservience, with a focus. Are we there? Are we able to do it? Who could say, even if we start with this very positive focus, it's inevitable. Soon after we start, other things drift into our minds. But when we begin, we say, give us the ability that the words should be praise, not duplicitous, not two-faced, which is considered a disgrace. That's the introductory phrase, Hashem sfosai tiftoch ufi yagiti losecho. There's a story, Tzfas, which is known as Sfad in English, in the 1500s, was known as Ir HaMekubalim. It was the city of the Kabbalists, who had lived in Tzfas, up north, the Arizal. Rav Yosef Karo, who's the author of the Shulchan Aruch, who merited that God had sent him a malach, an angel, to teach him certain aspects of Torah. Rav Shlomo Alkabitz, the author of the Chododi, who was a great Kabbalist. And there was a person by the name of Ramosh Alshich. There's a commentary on Torah called Alshich. They all prayed in the same shul. Could you imagine what kind of shul this was? The Arizal, Rav Yosef Karo, the Chazan, the Cantor, we'll use the word Shlich Tzibor. The representation of the congregation was Shlomo Alkabitz, the author of the L'Chododi. He was the Chazan. Rav Yosef Karo was the Rav. He gave the halachic rulings. The Arizal was the holy master, the greatest Kabbalist since Rab Shimon Yochai. And Rav Moshe Alshich was the one who said the drasha. He would speak in shul to give the drasha on Shabbos, the Torah lecture. Could you imagine what kind of shul this is? Unbelievable. It must have been like Sinai. There was a flame, like the flame of an inferno. That was the holiness of the shul. And Rav Yosef Karo being the Rav, for the Amidah, you always wait for the rabbi. When he finishes the Shemona Esrei, then you begin the repetition of the Amidah. Rav Yosef Karo authored the Shulchan Aruch. But the code of laws is based upon his commentary on the Torah. The Torah was Rabbi Yaakov. Ben Rabbeinu Osher was the son of Rabbeinu Osher the Rosh. Rabbeinu Osher was a student of the Maram of Rutenberg. The Maram of Rutenberg, Rav Meir Rutenberg, was the leading Torah sage of Ashkenazic Jewry in the year 1200, 1250. And he's the famous one where the vassal king had taken him hostage. And he wanted a tremendous amount of ransom for him. And he put him in a tower, and he died in the tower. Rami Rutenberg. Rabbeinu Osher was his closest student. He was his halachic protege. And he had to flee from Germany because he died in captivity. And after he died, he wanted to ransom his body. And Rami Rutenberg had given the order, he forbade they should raise the ransom money. Why? Because if the Gentile kings would see they're able to take the Torah leaders and put them up for ransom, they'll totally deplete. Financially, they'll strip the Jews of all their finances. Therefore, he forbade it. And therefore, the Maram Rutenberg died in the tower. Rabbi Osher fled to Spain at the time, and he was the leading Torah sage of the Ashkenazi community in Spain. And even Sephardic Jews started to follow his position. Rabbeinu Yaakov is the son of Rabbeinu Osher. In the back of the Talmud, there's a commentary called Rosh, Rabbeinu Osher. All the tour of Rabbeinu Yaakov, the basis for all his halachic rulings mainly is his father's position, which was the Ashkenazic position in halacha. That's the tour. The tour had compiled the first code of laws, the 4 sections of the Shulchan Aruch. Rav Yosef Karo had written a treatise on the tour, citing the Sephardic position, citing many responsive from the Rashba, Reb Shalom ben Aderes, and other Sephardic the sizes and commentators, and very often he argues with the Torah. Of course, the Torah is the Ashkenazic position, and the Beis Yosef, all the sources he quotes, which is mainly the Rambam and the Rif, that's the Ashkenaz, that's the Sephardic position. If you ever look through the commentary, the treatise of the Rabbi Yosef Karo on the Torah, every page is about 60 lines, quoting endless responsa. his level, he was such a trove of Torah knowledge. It's not to be believed what he knew. To be able to compile, and he distilled from that. He distilled and that he authored the Shulchan Aruch. That was the bottom line of all compiling all this information and distilling it, and that's the Sephardic position. Whenever the Ramoshe Isserles argues on the Shulchan Aruch, on the Code of Laws, that's the Ashkenazic position, because that's based on Ashkenazic early commentators, which weren't in agreement with the Rambam or Rabbi Yitzchak Fassi, which is the Rif. Let's give you the background. So the Beis Yosef, he was known as the Beis Yosef because his name was Rabbi Yosef Karo. And that's his commentary on the Torah. It's called Beis Yosef. His mind was always occupied thinking in Torah, continuous. So when he said the Amidah, it was inevitable, Torah thought would enter into his mind. So normally, let's say even if he would say the Amidah, it would take him 20 minutes, a half an hour, which would be considered, or an hour. As it says in the Talmud, the Hasidim Rishonim took him an hour to pray. Sometimes it took longer. And the Arizal, it was known, he knew exactly what was going on in people's minds because he was such a great Kabbalist. So he knew right away the reason why they're waiting is because Rabbi Yosef Karo was distracted with some kind of Torah thought. So the Arizal gives the order to Reb Shlomo Alkabetz, who was the Chazan, begin. Don't wait for the rabbi. Because if the rabbi would be preoccupied with the Amid is one thing. But now that he's been distracted with Torah thought, we don't have to wait for him, just keep going. So we're speaking about even to be occupied with Torah thought, it's inevitable. If your mind is always permeated and fully invested in Torah, all of a sudden now I take a break. So how do you somehow extricate yourself from your essence, what the mind is fully invested in, and shift in one moment all that as if it doesn't exist? As if it's not something which I'm concerned about, or I have to somehow clarify or elucidate. It's almost impossible. So we say to Hashem, we're not even talking if the mind is occupied with minutiae, with foolishness, even it's occupied with the holiest of holy. But when you stand before God and you speak to God, you have to be fully invested in the words that you're saying. There should be no other thoughts in your mind other than that. So that kind of person, when he says to Hashem, Hashem sosai tiftach ufiya geti lasecha, what does he want to be removed from? That it shouldn't be Torah thought, which Hashem wants your mind should be fully invested in that. But at this moment, during the Abidah, my mouth should speak your praises. Praises means only speaking about you, not to be distracted even with the Torah concept or with a responsa, whatever it may be. So if even David, he was the king of Israel, the greatest king, where every aspect of his being, and David is referred to by God as David Avdi. He's my servant. David is my servant. After the patriarchs, David is the next one in terms of the infrastructure of the Jewish people. And he has to make a supplication before he begins the Amidah. Hashem sosai tiftach fi ageti losecha. Allow the words that come out of my mouth should be truly praise, because David had other things on his mind. What do he have on his mind? What they call God's glory. That the Jewish people should be in a position where they are truly meeting God's standard of what a Jew is meant to be. But factually, when you stand before God and have an audience, you want to say, my words should be God's praises, not distracted with other things other than what I'm saying. So where, as I used to say, the Chofetz Chaim would do tshuva 45 minutes a year for Bittul Torah. And every time he felt the moment wasn't invested properly, he would make a notation in a small notebook. And before Yom Kippur, he would do tshuva for 45 minutes where he felt the time wasn't invested properly in Torah study. So I always say, hopefully our learning should be the equivalent of what he was not learning. You understand? David is concerned that maybe the words that he says are not sufficiently invested with that focus where it's truly God's praises. It's falling short of that. But that's exactly what we're saying. Since we have no control over our minds, and our minds, unfortunately, are distracted and occupied with other things, there's no question. A person who's sincere and we say to Hashem, we truly want to say your praises. Assist us to say your praises. So as long as we say the words, we're going to do our best not to be distracted, but as best as you could do, you need that assistance to maintain and retain that focus. That's why we introduced the Amidah with this verse from Tehillim, Hashem Sosei Tiftach, Ufi Agiti Losecha, for that reason. We had mentioned that the Gemara tells us in Brochos that the early Hasidim, the devoutly righteous, they would spend an hour in preparation of tefillah. It would take them an hour to pray. And after they prayed for an hour, they would reflect for an hour on that experience. Because reflecting on that experience, what was it? Because being touched in a certain way, if you immediately, fleetingly go elsewhere, you lose whatever that was. So to be able to internalize the experience and be a full beneficiary of the experience, they would reflect on it for an hour afterwards. And they would do this 3 times a day. But we understand, before we begin, we definitely need that reflection, that contemplation, and that level of preparation. Because you have to focus and meditate to somehow push out all other thoughts out of our minds and focus and understand what we're about to go. I'll give you an example. Lahavdil. Person graduated business school and he has an opportunity, one of a kind of opportunity. And if he does well on the interview, his path to success is really set in motion. And the person who was able to secure that appointment for him and that interview was a person who had that level of connection that he could. And he told him, he gave him good advice. You really have to prepare that every word and every question which conceivably they could ask you, that you respond as a professional, as top of the class of graduates of business school. And if you do, they will appreciate your value and they will hire you. And the person really is bent to succeed under any circumstance. And he understands this is the ultimate opportunity. And the appointment is a month off. This person is preoccupied with this appointment, with this opportunity, 24 hours a day. And in his mind, he keeps reviewing exactly how is he going to present himself? What is he going to say? What won't he say? And things he thought he should say, now he realizes he shouldn't say. And he's constantly refining it. Till finally he's about to go for the interview and he feels confident. And even when he's confident, he's not sure. The interviewer may ask him something, or he may say something which may not be right, and it may cause him not to be seen for what he really is. For a month, he's been thinking about this, practicing mentally everything, his emotion, fully invested. Why? Because since that moment, that opportunity, he understands his life depends on it, financially speaking. And his opportunity of being able to climb that financial ladder and go from one point to another, he knows everything hinges on that moment. That's why it's the focus of his mind and his emotion and his whole being. The Hasidim Rishonim, they were Hasidim. They always lived devoutly righteous, pious lives. Their mind was that. But you know what it means now to stand before the master? Even they felt without that hour of preparation, they weren't sufficiently there mentally, emotionally, focus-wise, unless they negated everything pushed everything out of their minds, out of their motion. When I speak to the master, it's only the master. Other acts of piety, other involvements in holiness, it's not relevant to this moment. So they would need an hour to create that single focus, only God, nothing but that. That's why it took them an hour in preparation. And when they prayed, understanding to who are you praying, every word has to be articulated and pronounced and infused with that level of reverence and love and subordination to the master. It took an hour. And after having that kind of experience, to be a beneficiary of the value, you know, there's a concept, out of sight, out of mind. They didn't want it to be immediately, even onto something of other level of holiness, but it's a unique experience. But that itself tells you to what degree that you value it. I'll give you an example. Lahavdil. Person goes, and he plans a trip to go on a safari. $50,000, $100,000. Today it's probably more. And he gets all his Land Rovers and all his people who are going to accompany him there with their guns. And this Land Rover go through mud up to the door. Could you imagine? And he has a film crew that's going to film his whole experience on the safari. When he pets the lion, and he has this guide with a gun that if the lion should pounce him, he kills the lion on the spot. But you don't see that on the film. When the film crew is filming all this. And he has a phenomenal, once-in-a-lifetime experience on the safari. He experiences nature like nobody's ever experienced nature. And the amount of money invested. And very few people could afford this kind of experience. He comes back, he's busy showing the film and explaining and to all his friends who can't afford this, what kind of experience he had. And every time he shows the film, he's like reliving what he was there when he was on the safari. Because that's what it was all about. You know what it was all about? Me and me and me. And he lives that me even afterwards. And he glows whenever he shows that film. Because what resonates is the cost. And he tells his friends, you know what this cost? Not even talking about the trip. What about the film crew? We're not just transporting the film back to the States. It wasn't simple. Had to get a special climate controlled plane that the film shouldn't in any way be affected, you know, the color and everything else and every nuance to replicate all that. So lahavdil elav avdolos, you have a once in a lifetime experience and you truly experience. You're standing in God's presence and you sense his presence. And the reason why you sense his presence is because you negate it. Because the more you negate it, the more you sense him. The more there's of you, the less you sense him. And you sense it, you experienced it. You don't want to lose that feeling, not for a moment. And you want to internalize it, that it should be integrated into your being. Because now, after that hour, your function is a different function, totally different function. The Ramchal writes that a prophet with God communicates to that person. And a prophet, when God communicates, it's not through the physical faculty. It's directly through the soul. God connects with the neshama of the person. And the experience of prophecy is so overwhelming that unless God would put the prophet on life support, a person would not be able to tolerate physically the experience. He would die. he would die instantaneously. Years ago, they used to speak about the electric chair. And when they put that person on that electric chair, lahavdil, they would put a hood on him, and they would put certain leather tethers to tether him to that chair, because the amount of electricity went through that body, I'm not sure how many volts, hundreds of thousands of volts. When they used to say he was fried, literally. He had to have the tether and that hood because everything was totally burnt. It's like a person got being struck by lightning. No different. The divine presence connecting with that person's soul, the body could not tolerate that experience. The person would expire instantaneously. God has to put that person on life support. He should live despite the fact that humanly it's impossible to tolerate that experience. That's what it is. So the Ramchal writes that even a prophet who prophesizes, you could prophesize for a nanosecond, but because it's with the soul, there's no concept of time and space. God can communicate in a nanosecond what takes a person 100 years to accumulate knowledge-wise through the conventional manner of accumulation of knowledge. After you have that experience as a prophet, you will become a different human being. Once you're touched by God at that level, everything you experience, you see through different eyes. Your emotion is a different emotion. When we say you've been touched, we don't even understand what it means, the meaning of you've been touched. And that prophet has been touched. He functions differently. He processes things differently. His reality is different. The Hasidim Rishonim, they lived their lives. They didn't, if the Chazal, if the Talmud is referring to him as Hasidim, we're not talking about, he went and bought himself, the kaftan and the hat and he had the whole getup. These were truly devoutly righteous people. We can't even relate to what they were, where every moment of their being was fully invested in serving God at every level, at the most advanced level. They themselves had a capacity to internalize we can't even relate to. They would prepare an hour to have that encounter or audience with God. They would speak to him for an hour. Every word was articulated and focused, totally invested in that experience. Afterwards, they would reflect an hour. They were different people after that experience. But to be able to fully maximize on the experience, they had to reflect on that every moment of that experience, because they were touched every moment. At every moment you internalize that level to what degree you were touched. When you finish, you're a different being. You see things differently. People who merit not only to meet special people, but they have a capacity that they appreciate when they met that person that he was special. Sometimes they walk away, and the person is a changed person because of that meeting, that one meeting with that person. I'm talking about a holy person. I'll tell you a story I heard from Rabbi Pinto many years ago. There was a certain person who lived in Paris, and he only spoke French, didn't speak Hebrew, didn't speak Yiddish, and he was about to marry a non-Jewish woman. And as much as they spoke to him, he was a Sephardic Jew, they couldn't convince him to separate from this woman and not marry. He's married, he's engaged. So Rabbi Pinto made a request to him. He says, I want you to travel to Israel, and I want you to go see Rav Shach. Rav Shach was the leading Torah sage in Israel at the time. Must have been then a man already in his upper 80s. He lived till the age of 107. He was a Shiva of the Panovich Yeshiva. And I want you to tell him what you're going to do. And I want you to hear what he has to say. And if even after he tells you why you go through with it, I have nothing more to say. We've done our best to discourage you. If not, we're not going to discuss it any longer. So he travels to Israel, and Rabbi Pinto sets up the appointment for him, and he meets Rav Shach. The person who explained to Rav Shach why he's there, person that only speaks French, can't, and there was no interpreter, no interpreter. There was somebody who was going to interpret, but there's the story. So Rav Shach, he was an unbelievable person. I had the privilege of meeting him many times. Holy, his dimension, his presence was something phenomenal. His purity, he had the purity of a little child. That's how pure he was. You think it was Navite, there was nothing he didn't know. He could read you inside out better than a CAT scan and an MRI and other things, even things they haven't yet developed. That's how he understood a person. And the person comes to him and they tell Rav Shach the story. Rav Shach starts speaking to him in Yiddish. In Yiddish. Explain to him why it's forbidden and why he's cutting off his line, how he's destroying his soul, and every reason why not. And Rav Shach becomes very emotional and speaks to him and everything else to convince him he should break this relationship. So the person who was going to interpret what Rav Shach said to this person who only speaks French, the person who speaks French says, it's not necessary. I don't need interpretation. I'm leaving. I heard what the rabbi said. And okay, nobody knew exactly what was going on in this Frenchman's head. He gets back to France. He tells Rabbi Pinto, I'm not marrying the girl. He says, why not? Because Rav Shach said to me, gave me every reason why I should not marry him. He says, but what did he say? He says, I don't know what he said, but I know he said I shouldn't marry her. He broke it. That's the story. He had the sense of what the man was telling him. It touched him to such a degree, he didn't have to understand the words. He understood, if this is what we're about, Judaism is this rabbi, that's who we are, there's no way I can marry the shiksa. I'm using the word shiksa. No way. Impossible. If you're touched at a certain level, the rest of your day is a different day. You see things differently. You internalize things differently. Your decisions are at a different level. What was important becomes unimportant. What was significant, all of a sudden you realize it's not as significant as you thought it was. It may have no value whatsoever. There's an expression, penny wise, pound foolish. But sometimes you realize it's not even penny wise, even on a penny level, it's foolish. When you have things in perspective, but things in perspective that you shouldn't be touched by emotion, you have to be able to internalize that perspective. Because when you internalize, it becomes part of your emotion. Once that's your emotion, nothing can interfere because that's what I want. You know, the Talmud speaks about doing something for the sake of a mitzvah, what we call lishma. So let's say a person studies Torah, that he wants to be a rabbi. Wants to be a rabbi. They pay a $400,000 salary, car, home, retirement. It's a good thing. So he studies, and he's the best student because he wants to get that job. And he knew he has to really study well because otherwise there are other contenders for that position. That's called shlo lishma. He did not study for the right reason. But you realize, because he wanted that position, the salary, the financial package, and all that was entailed in there, he was never distracted. Going to a show never distracted him because he's that kind of rabbi. He could have gone to a show. Because he understood what the pot of gold at the end of Rebbe was. It wasn't going to the show. But if a person would study purely to serve God, it's not so simple. Because who are we? What is our emotion? We're physical beings. We have egos. We want other things. We also have rights. We are also entitled. This man, when he studied to get that job, that was his entitlement. So he never had an interruption in that. He was on the beeline, straight to get there. The person who wants to be that righteous, holy person, he's not on a beeline. He's encountering continuous impediments on the way to get there. The Hasidim Rishonim, they somehow internalized because they spiritualized their being, their emotion. Therefore, there was no contradiction. Everything was in sync. But they understood how easy it is to lose that. And unless you keep ascending, like you have the laws of gravity, whatever goes up, comes down. That's only if you don't keep going. But if you keep ascending, you're not coming down, you're going straight up. And they understood that. Therefore, it wasn't enough just to prepare for an hour. And the Amida was an hour. They reflected afterwards for an hour, ready for the next encounter, because they did this 3 times a day. And unless you have that vision and that understanding of what it takes to break through all those barriers, to internalize something, there's so much slippage. You make 1 step progress, you regress 6 steps. And you can't get yourself up that wall. You can't climb. It's literally a vertical mountain. Straight up. But Hashem assists the person who truly wants to scale that El Capitan, whatever that mountain's called, without grappling irons. Okay, we're going to stop here today. Any comments?